This advanced video on the bar position in the squat is going to talk about high bar versus low bar. There's lots of gradations and gray room in between what we consider a high bar and a low bar. For the purpose of this video, we'll just address the two spectrums between being a high bar and a low bar. So what is a high bar versus a low bar? I consider a high bar to be where the bar sits nearly on top of the traps, for sure above the rear delts. Usually it's on top of the traps. A lot of times you'll see Olympic lifters and bodybuilders squatting with this style. And a low bar is something you'll see powerlifters doing more of. And this is where I consider the bar sitting on top of the rear delt and even a little bit lower. So when we create the tightness in our back and we have our lats engaged and our shoulders pulled in, your rear delt gets flexed and pops out, and it creates a nice little shelf for the bar. So that's the difference between what a high bar and a low bar sits. If the goal is to lift as much weight as possible in the back squat, the low bar is the superior way to go. If the goal is athletic performance, quad development, or some other physique or specific training principle, like you're trying to strengthen your quads as a powerlifter, but if athletic performance or quad development is the goal, then the high bar is the way to go. Jumping into more detail on the low bar, again, that shelf is created with the rear delts, and you can really do an extreme low bar by not sitting on top of the rear delts, but sitting in the rear delts. The rear delts will create a cushion and somewhere for that bar to sit and drive into, but what this will require is a little bit of a forward angle of your torso. So if your torso is completely vertical, that bar is not going to have a place to sit. You're going to have a little bit of a forward lean to allow that bar to sink in to your rear delts and create a friction angle so the bar doesn't slide or roll off. With the low bar, it can be harder to achieve depth because you're going to have this forward lean to your torso, which means you're going to get into a deep hip flexion, which this is hip flexion. You're going to get into a deep hip flexion earlier than you would if you had a more upright torso, which means your hips can start to lock up on you sooner and your back can get to its end of range of healthy motion sooner with a low bar position, which can make it harder to achieve deep below parallel depth. The advantage of the low bar squat is that it involves more strong, large muscle groups as the prime movers. So a high bar is going to have a higher percentage, a higher piece of the pie of the quads being the prime mover. A properly executed low bar squat, you're going to have a lot more glute involvement, still a lot of quad involvement, and a ton of hamstring involvement. It's going to require a little bit more out of the low back, but that's more of a static strength endurance standpoint than anything else. But the low bar is going to involve more large muscle groups as the prime movers, which means it raises your ceiling of how much you can squat. One of the main cues on the low bar squat is you want to keep your shins as vertical as possible. The deeper you get, the more those shins are going to have to come at an angle forward to get that depth. But the more you can keep those shins vertical and sink straight down into your hips, the less that you're going to have involvement on the quads, the more involvement you're going to translate to your glutes, hamstrings, hips, which are going to be the stronger prime movers. Another big cue for the low bar squat is keeping the knees out. So like I talked about, it's harder to get depth with a low bar squat because of that forward lean and that forward angle. Because of that, pushing your knees out as you get to the bottom is going to give yourself a little bit more room in your hips to achieve that proper depth. Generally, the best assistance that I can suggest for you on a low bar back squat is going to be a good morning. A good morning is going to translate more to your low bar back squat than any other compound movement. So high bar. Like I said, the high bar, the bar is generally going to sit on your traps, maybe the top of your delts, but it's going to be a lot higher than low bar. The torso in the high bar squat is generally going to be more upright, which also means that it's going to be easier to achieve depth. The knees are going to have more forward travel. The shins aren't going to be able to stay quite as vertical, and generally your stance is going to be a little bit more narrow. This is going to involve more of the quads, which depending on your goals can be a good thing. It is going to be a tougher requirement on the quads because of these things mentioned, which again, for some people like Olympic lifters is the goal because that's going to carry over better to their competition lifts. If you're a power lifter, but you're going through a hypertrophy phase or one of your side goals is to increase your quad hypertrophy, then high bar back squats is a great way to go. Bodybuilders commonly want to do high bar back squats because the purpose of that is trying to grow the quads. The best assistance for strengthening a front squat, I would say, are two things: either a safety bar squat if you have that, because it's pretty close to a high bar squat, and the other would be a front squat because it's an extra degree further of an emphasis on the quads than a back squat is.